The Supreme Court's ruling allowing the President Trump's executive order on mail-in. It's actually the way he votes, right? Mail-in, right?
Yeah, he just did it a week or so ago, as a matter of fact. And the clock is ticking on this because mail-in ballots are going out next week in North Carolina. They got to figure this out soon. The president's order, signed in March, calls for his administration to create a list of eligible voters and directs the United States Postal Service to deliver mail-in ballots only to people on those lists created by the Trump administration. The Supreme Court's conservative majority did not decide on the legality of that executive order. It instead ruled that 23 states who have sued did not have the legal right to challenge the order because the states could not demonstrate there was sufficient harm by voting rules that had not yet taken effect. Joining us now, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Good morning to you both. So, Lisa, let's help our viewers understand this a little bit better, that the Supreme Court was not commenting on the legality of this, as I said, just on standing for the states that are suing. But as I also said, the clock really is ticking on this because ballots are about to go out. So if you can explain the ruling a little bit, but then also how quickly it might come back to the Supreme Court.
It absolutely might come back very quickly to the Supreme Court, and not necessarily in this case. Let me explain a little bit about what this ruling does, because there's a lot of confusion about it. Technically, what the court is doing is staying what a lower court enjoined. Basically, a lower court prohibited the implementation of certain sections of the president's election integrity-focused executive order. But he can't technically move forward with the parts of it that govern mail-in ballots yet, because another lower court has an injunction that's still in place that prohibits the United States Postal Service from giving effect to its rules about mail-in balloting. That having been said, here are the couple of things that the president can do right now. He can authorize the Department of Homeland Security to start compiling lists of citizens in each state sent out to those states. And he can also tell the DOJ that they have to prioritize the prosecution of people who give ballots to those who are unauthorized to vote. The majority here says those two things are not connected and that they don't force states to do anything. But the three dissenting justices say you have to see these two things as of a piece. If you give states a list of citizens who are allowed to vote, and you also tell DOJ, go after the people who give ballots to people who are unauthorized to vote, what you're essentially doing is saying you had the list all along. And if you give a ballot to someone who's not authorized to vote, the fact that you're giving them a list of citizens is something that DOJ may use in the future to say you intentionally did this, you recklessly did this. In other words, as Justice Sotomayor says, you're basically giving people tools that you're going to use against them in future prosecutions. That could very much chill state and local election officials in their provision of ballots. Obviously, giving state citizenship lists to people who are supportive of the president's agenda is also potentially a problem. Think about red states with deep blue cities that maybe have large immigrant populations. That's where you could see the use of these citizenship lists being potentially really pernicious in the lead up to the November election.
So, Ken Dilanian, there are so many layers to this story. First of all, we should remind everyone how vanishingly rare fraud in mail-in voting is, perhaps why, as Mika said, the president uses this. In the 2024 election, about 30% of ballots were sent in via mail. Of those, found the Brookings Institute, there were 4 documented cases in 10 million ballots of fraud. So let's start there. Then there's the idea of this list, a political list perhaps started by the Trump administration. There is the stacking of the board of governors at the post office, making the post office a political arm of this administration. So how are you looking at this through the prism of the courts, but also of the government using the post office in this way?
Right. Well, that is extraordinary, Willie, because, as you know, the Constitution says that the states dictate the time and manner of elections, and it allows the Congress to make rules governing national elections, but nowhere does it mention the president's role in elections. And yet the Trump administration is coming in here and saying, we control the Postal Service, we're the executive branch, so we can tell the Postal Service to decline to treat and deal with and convey certain mail-in ballots. That's extraordinary. The other extraordinary thing about this decision is that it's once again an example of where the conservative majority has said, no, we're not ruling on the merits, but you haven't shown that you've been injured yet. You states have not shown that you have actually experienced an injury, and so we can't rule yet. And the the dissenters, the liberals, are saying, you got to be kidding me. The midterms are around the corner. Are you saying that we have to wait until the Trump administration improperly interferes in an election that's supposed to be governed by the states before you will act? And yet that's what the Supreme Court has done here. And it's not the first time they've done this in other cases involving the Trump administration. As Lisa said, it's not the end of the story. We're going to see more litigation on this. And the Supreme Court may well ultimately decide that what's happening here is improper. But what they've done is they've left a sense of unease here, along with all the other ways that we are concerned that the Trump administration is going to try to interfere in the elections with this midterm. Here is the latest example, Willie.
And yet another moment where the Supreme Court, of course, seems highly deferential to President Trump and the executive branch, the conservative majority, at times acting like it's part of the team. And J-Mart, let's talk about the politics of this. You know, the polls suggest this November we could be heading for a Democratic wave. And strategists in both parties think the House is heavily favored to go Democrat. Senate, true toss-up now, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago, considering the map looked pretty favorable for Republicans. But now Democrats think they've got a chance. But there's been this fear hovering over this election for a year or more that the Trump administration was going to find a way to put its thumb on the scale, whether that was the ICE agents in the streets, the National Guard, trying to crack down on voter rolls. You know, of course, we'll see if they even accept the results, if they don't like them come November. But here it appears, at least temporarily, they're getting yet another assist from the courts.
Yeah, let's just get straight to the point. The coverage and the attention to this ruling would be vanishingly small, at least in terms of the national media, were it not for precedent, to borrow a legal term. We all lived through the 2020 election and the aftermath, John. Like that's the reason for the concern. We know what Trump is capable of, and we know the degree to which we as a country relied on the courts in the aftermath of 2020 to effectively cast aside Trump's challenges one after the other and affirm Joe Biden's election and swearing in as president. So once again, we're at the mercy of the courts. That's why this matters so much, because, yes, I think there is this assumption, for good reason, given his past action, that Trump is not going to sit by and lose control of one or both chambers of Congress without a protracted fight that invariably will get into the courts. And here we will be again, much as we were 6 years ago, hoping and waiting for the court to do the right thing.
So, Lisa, let's talk about next steps. At the Supreme Court, as you said, that may be back there very quickly. What happens from here after yesterday's ruling?
Well, first of all, Willie, there's the stay that the Supreme Court entered yesterday on that case will be in effect until a federal appeals court can rule and until this case comes back to the Supreme Court. So it's not necessarily in this case that will be back before the Supreme Court, but there is another injunction in place. That's in a case brought by the League of Women Voters, and that still prohibits the president from implementing the part about the United States Postal Service and mail-in balloting. That's the part where the USPS basically says to states, you send us your lists of people who are eligible to vote by mail, and we're only going to send in the ballots of people who are on your lists. There's an injunction against that rule taking effect. However, late last night, Department of Justice went to the court and said, we're asking you to reconsider your ruling in light of this Supreme Court ruling. And if you don't, we're going to ask a federal appeals court to do the exact same thing, stay your ruling. If that happens, you can bet that the losing party will be back before the Supreme Court faster than we can say go.
So, Ken, let's talk about why the Trump administration is doing this politically, because they see what perhaps is coming down the pike, at least in the House of Representatives come midterm elections a couple of months from now. But why are they going to such lengths to use the machinery of government to make it harder to vote by mail?
Yeah, and it's not just the Trump administration, it's Republican attorneys general. Look, I mean, we've seen this for years, right? Republicans don't like mail-in voting. They believe that it favors the Democrats. Donald Trump made mail-in voting a central plank of his bogus arguments that the 2020 election was fraudulent. Remember, he said he went to bed and he was ahead, and then he woke up and he was losing. And so because of mail-in voting, he claimed. And so but that argument's been with us for years. What's new here is the Trump administration using the levers of government to try to stop Americans from exercising their right to vote in a way that their own states and the people they elected to govern elections have dictated is okay. And they're using every possible avenue, not just this one. And again, as I said earlier, that's part of a panoply of levers they're trying to pull to potentially try to influence this upcoming election, including, I'm covering the Justice Department. I hear people concerned every day about what the FBI, what the DOJ could do in a contested state if they decide to pursue bogus allegations of fraud by, for example, serving a search warrant and seizing voting machines or somehow interfering, sending armed agents to polls, even though the law prohibits that. So there is a lot of concern right now about what this says about what the Trump administration is willing to do in this upcoming election, guys.
And they've already shown it in the state of Georgia, going in and seizing all those ballots a few months back.